laughed, shoved, and called him names, never realizing the man they were humiliating would soon walk into their station as the highest-ranking officer they had to salute. It was just another warm afternoon in the heart of the city. People were going about their day, shopping, grabbing coffee, and hurrying to appointments. On the side of a busy street, a black man stood next to a black SUV, dressed in a clean gray suit, quietly talking on his phone. He looked calm, focused, and professional. But to patrolling officers driving by, he looked suspicious. They slowed down, stared for a moment, then pulled over. The man noticed them approaching and ended his call. He stood still, with a polite smile, as they walked up. Is this your vehicle? One officer asked sharply, eyeing him from head to toe. Yes, officer. Is something wrong? The man replied politely. You don't look like someone who belongs in this area, the second officer said, crossing his arms. The man stayed calm, even as people nearby started to glance over. The tone of the officers was aggressive, not violent, but clearly disrespectful. One of them asked for ID, the other walked around his car, checking the plates. The man sighed softly and handed over his ID. You'll want to remember that name, he said quietly. The officers smirked. Is that a threat? One mocked. No, the man replied, still calm, just a fact. They didn't find anything wrong. After a few more questions, they gave back his ID and walked away, still laughing under their breath. The man stood there a moment longer, watching them go, then got into his car and drove off. What those officers didn't know was that this wasn't just some random man on the street. He had come to this city with purpose. He had just arrived from a leadership program in Washington, D.C., and within hours he would be announced as the new chief of police, the very man those officers would soon have to salute. But for now, they only saw a man they thought they could bully, not knowing that justice was already walking beside them. Back at the police station, the atmosphere was relaxed as officers returned from their shifts and gathered in the common room. Laughter echoed from a corner where two officers joked about an incident earlier that day, how they'd stopped a well-dressed black man who looked out of place standing next to an expensive car. They chuckled over how serious he tried to act, mocking his calm response and the way he told them to remember his name. He really thought he was someone important, one of them said, shaking his head. Probably some guy playing dress-up, the other added. Their laughter drew a few glances, but no one questioned it. Moments later, the station's atmosphere shifted as the captain called for everyone to gather in the briefing room. We have a very important announcement, he said firmly, his tone wiping the smirks off faces. The department has officially appointed a new chief of police. He'll be arriving shortly to meet the team. The room went silent. Officers looked at each other with curiosity, some adjusting their uniforms, others murmuring guesses about who it might be. The two officers who had mocked the man earlier leaned back casually, clearly uninterested. They had no idea what was coming. Minutes later, the door opened, and all eyes turned to see the new chief walk in. In that moment, jaws dropped and whispers filled the room. It was him, the same black man in the gray suit they had humiliated just hours before. But now he stood tall, wearing the official chief's uniform, his badge shining on his chest. The room fell completely silent. The two officers froze in place, their faces pale, unable to look him in the eye. He stood at the front of the room and let the silence linger, his calm presence now undeniable. Without a hint of anger, he spoke. Clearly, before we begin, I want each of you to think about how you treat the people you serve, because leadership means more than a badge. It begins with respect. And just like that, everything had changed. The room was still filled with shock as the new chief of police stood before them, calm and composed. No one spoke. The two officers who had confronted him earlier looked like they wanted to disappear. The chief didn't shout, didn't call anyone out by name. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Dressed in full uniform, with polished boots and a golden badge on his chest, he carried himself with quiet strength. He looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting those of the two officers, but he didn't linger. Instead, he began his speech, speaking clearly and firmly, not to shame anyone but to remind them of what it truly meant to wear the badge. He spoke about honor, about protecting, not judging the people on the street. Respect, he said, is the foundation of trust between law enforcement and the community. Without it, we are nothing more than uniforms with empty power. His words struck deep. Every officer in the room, young and old, listened closely. Some nodded slowly, others looked down, especially the two who had mocked him earlier. The chief didn't mention the earlier incident directly, but everyone knew. It was written in the silence, in the way the two officers couldn't raise their heads. After the meeting, instead of leaving immediately, the chief stayed behind and approached the very two officers who had humiliated him. They tensed up, bracing for anger or punishment, but what came next surprised them. The chief invited them to his office for a private conversation. No yelling, no threats, just a conversation. He calmly asked them, "Why did you treat me the way you did?" They didn't have an answer. He continued, "If I had been someone without a badge or title, would you have treated me any better?" Silence. Then he said, "That's the problem. And with that, he stood up and walked away, leaving the officers sitting with the weight of their actions. It wasn't revenge, it was a lesson. A quiet, powerful reminder that true leadership doesn't demand fear, it inspires change. In the days that followed, the mood inside the police station slowly began to change. The new chief didn't come in with harsh orders or heavy punishments, he led by example. He arrived early, walked the halls with quiet confidence, and took time to speak with everyone, from rookie officers to front desk staff. The two officers who had once mocked him felt the pressure of guilt growing heavier each day. They weren't suspended or publicly humiliated, but something about the chief's calm and respectful way made them reflect harder than any punishment could. He didn't hold grudges, but he didn't forget either. One afternoon, the chief sat down again with those two officers, not as their superior, but as a man who had experienced what so many others had. He asked them questions that went deeper than police work. Have you ever stopped someone because of how they looked, not because of what they did? They were quiet. Then he asked, do you think fear or bias guides your actions more than facts? The officers looked at each other, uncomfortable but listening. The chief didn't lecture them. He shared stories of his own times he had been pulled over, followed in stores, or ignored in meetings before anyone knew who he was. He told them how those moments made him feel less human, less safe, and less seen. For the first time, the two officers saw not just a chief, but a man who had been through the same streets they walked only without the protection of a uniform. That conversation left a deep mark. From that day, both officers started acting differently, not out of fear, but out of understanding. They listened more during calls, spoke more respectfully to citizens, and even apologized privately to the chief. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began with a single moment of truth, and the chief, he never needed to raise his voice or demand respect. He earned it, quietly and powerfully, by showing what real leadership looks like, not just wearing the badge, but living its meaning every day. Weeks passed, and what began as a tense and uncomfortable situation slowly turned into a story of change, not just inside the police station but out in the community. The new chief didn't sit behind a desk all day. He walked the neighborhoods, spoke with business owners, played basketball with local kids, and listened to the concerns of everyday people. His presence wasn't about authority, it was about connection. Word began to spread, and slowly, trust started to rebuild where it had long been broken. Officers who once avoided community conversations were now joining them, asking questions instead of giving commands. The two officers who had once mocked the chief were now quietly becoming his most active supporters, volunteering for community events and leading internal training sessions on respectful policing. It wasn't about image, it was about understanding what their job truly meant. The chief made it clear that mistakes could happen, but how you grow from them defines who you are. One day, at a citywide community event, the chief stood before a crowd of citizens, young and old. He didn't give a speech filled with titles or accomplishments. Instead, he told a simple story about a day when two officers stopped a man for looking out of place, and how that man turned out to be someone they would one day salute. The crowd listened in silence, some shocked, others nodding. And then he said, real power isn't in the badge or the uniform, it's in how we treat each other, especially when we think no one is watching. The crowd applauded, not just for his words, but for the truth behind them. That day, something changed for good. The city saw what justice could look like when it's guided by dignity and compassion, and those who once laughed and judged now stood proudly behind a leader who had every reason to punish but instead chose to lead with strength, wisdom, and grace. The man they had once bullied became the man who inspired them all. And that, in the end, was the justice they never saw coming. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Deep Wounds for more powerful stories that reveal truth and inspire change.